Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar presented by ActiveNav and MC Bernstein Data. It is time to dump the junk. We're excited for a great conversation about deleting data.
So just a few years ago, the concept of tens or hundreds of terabytes of content, let alone petabytes, being held on your corporate networks was a somewhat distant prospect, but increasingly this is becoming the norm. And the data footprint for all organizations continues to grow at a rapid rate. Or as Buzz Lightyear might say if he worked in IT, this data is going to infinity and beyond. But what we've also found is that organizations are even better at ignoring the data, which is being stored outside of these database systems. This unstructured data, which might include collaborative office documents, emails, social media, blogs, images, videos, you name it, it's likely all out there on your network somewhere, and is typically held across a range of different data repositories, such as network file shares, SharePoint sites, Microsoft Exchange, personal drives, and increasingly in messaging applications like Teams or Slack. It really is a case of lots and lots of data, and this data being everywhere. So a recent Gartner market report estimated that this unstructured data represents over 80% of any organization's overall content. It's this unstructured data, or what we more appropriately refer to as dark data, which is typically unknown, unused, and often completely ignored, which is lurking on your corporate networks. And generally, it's this dark data that makes everything else less efficient. Okay, so with this chart, you can see a really useful way to picture how, with time, the value of information held in an organization decreases while the risks related to that information increases. The colors show the different types of information there on the left-hand side, such as office documents, product research, financial information, etc. And it really highlights that despite the different value that this information has to a business over time, you will see that after about 3 years, the risk to value gap keeps increasing across all types of data. So really the utility and benefit of this data reduces rapidly over time. And the report that I mentioned found that generally over a third of this data hasn't even been touched for over 3 years. So based on this, merely hitting the delete button to remove rot or redundant, obsolete, and trivial data and clear out this junk should really be a no-brainer, right?
So I'm sure everybody has heard the phrase, it's no one's problem, but everyone's problem. And that when does everyone's problem become nobody's responsibility? We see this time and time again in organizations where deleting of data, defensible disposition, which is so critical for all the things Andy mentioned, is something that everybody wants to do in the organization, but you really have to put a plan in place and you have to get the right people around the table. So typically what we've done, and we've been successful at this, is that first you have to have good policies. You can't start without really understanding what your policies are, whether that's the retention obligations, the regulatory drivers, the business obligations, etc. So you have to start with that. But then you also have to look at the risk and business priorities of the organization, because in order for you to be able to do this, you have to have all the critical components, which is the governance, the technology, the processes, etc. But you also have to have the right people around the table. One of the things that we've done is that you start small. You don't try to actually address this in large buckets of data. You have to really decide where are the biggest risks and where is most of the data that you want to address, and start small. And if you can show some quick wins and some information to the leaders and the stakeholders that you actually can make success just doing some quick, reasonable steps, you get the wind in your back and you could really actually start getting some more momentum in the organization.
Why is this so hard? One of the things is that everybody has an opinion and everybody has different concerns, and many people want to be involved. And there are a number of risks that people are concerned about, not only the risks that people in the organization want to reduce, but when we talk about defensible disposal, people see the risk in that process. So it could be, are we disposing of data that we are required to retain from a legal point of view? Do we have tax matters? What happens if we have to look for it in the future? If we're going to dispose of data, how do we know that how do we know that the data we are disposing is securely disposed? What about personal information? So there's a lot of different things that people will raise as concerns and objections, and stakeholders will have interest. And the first thing that you need to deal with is the fact that there is just so much data. And so some of the specific challenges are knowing who's responsible. So ultimately, when you engage in defensible disposal, you will have to talk to the data owners. Very rarely are you able to actually dispose of something, sort of on an in the background enterprise-wide approach. And you very often are going to have to find out who's responsible. And that's a challenge. Another big challenge is, and it sounds sort of silly, but it's true, that organizations don't know what it is when they have so much ungoverned data. So, it's easy to think of it as the equivalent of boxes and boxes with no labels on them. Similarly, where it is, there are lots of applications and data stores that are typically attached to the network, and people will be uncertain as to where the data that is redundant, obsolete, and trivial, or old enough to be no longer useful and therefore can be disposed, they won't know where it's located. So those are sort of some basic issues, but the biggest problem is, even if you can understand what you've got and where it is, how do you approach it given the scale of the data? You're going to need to engage people with some cross-organizational responsibility in order to accomplish defensible disposal. You're certainly going to have to talk to people in legal. You're certainly going to have IT. You're going to have information security. Usually the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer, is a critical participant in this. And so when you bring all those people together, this is not their first priority. Everybody has a priority, something other than this. When you get those folks and you want them to support the initiative, you've got to find some way of engaging with people who have limited time and limited awareness of these issues. So the best thing to do is not to try and solve all problems, not to try and meet all the objectives, and to start off identifying what's the critical objective that will make the most impact, make significant impact on the organization, bring a lot of value. Second thing is, and this is probably the most important thing, where to focus the effort. So there are two dimensions to that question. What are the time frames that will be most important? Are you trying to remediate a legacy data store, or are you trying to put in place good practices going forward? Ultimately, you should be doing both. And then tying that back to the critical objectives in terms of where you focus. So are you determining what to look at and make this a successful project by focusing on a specific business unit, and initially, let's say, to start, or a region, or a particular type of data, or a particular type of data store? So for instance, a certain set of file shares in a certain region. And that may sound not very ambitious, but you've got to test the operating model that you're putting in place. So you need to choose, you need to be able to go to the business leaders and say, we're going to be focusing on this kind of data in this area for this period of time to achieve this risk. And that's our initial starting point. And then the last point in terms of getting started is not to assume that there's one part of the operating model that needs to be addressed right up front, and that's the cure-all for everything.
Thanks, Matthew. Yeah, so the basic framework for any successful remediation effort, we believe, contains three key components. The first is you have to be able to get visibility into the data to really know what you're dealing with before you can actually work on remediating it, so fairly obvious. The second is developing measuring sticks, the premise being if you don't measure it, you won't be able to track your performance over time. And thirdly, you need the ability to act on those metrics or outcomes that you've measured in order to actually see the benefit from the process.
We talked a lot about this, but this is a really important component to basically do this effectively. You need governance. And when you develop a policy and it tells you the what that you need to do for an organization through the creation and disposition of information, really just gives you a high level of what the rules are. It's really important to produce those procedures, document those procedures in a consistent, reasonable, and also effective way that businesses as well as the other stakeholders can understand it. Because it's not just IT or the business group's responsibility, it's everyone. It's the individuals, the employees in the organization that create the data. They need to really understand how they go through that life cycle. I believe, even though we talked a lot about this, you have to start small. It's very hard to think about defensively disposing all information, particularly when we're talking about that the growth of this information is getting out of control in an organization. You have to look at what your risk and business objectives are. But it's not an ad hoc project. It's really a consistent program that the company needs to adopt. You have to have defensible operational strategies that everybody agrees to. You have to, as Andy said, have some innovative, highly automated technology to do this, because to defensively dispose manually, you'll never get to the end game. And then you absolutely have to have information governance oversight.
So this slide outlines that journey, how that typical journey looks for many of our customers. And as the strapline says, you cannot manage what you don't know you have, which is very true, of course. So that initial data discovery and building an inventory of your data to allow you to gain an understanding of the content that you hold is as we've said, the all-important first step for any data minimization effort. And then by leveraging the best practice highlighted by Matthew and Lynn, this will then certainly put you on the path towards implementing a broader information governance program.